Throughout human history, you can find countless examples of people being oppressed. Oppression is when one minority group gets discriminated against by dominant society. They might have their rights taken away, they might have social limitations, and they might not feel accepted. But history has proved that there's one thing that no amount of oppression can ever take away from you. That is your voice and your ability to speak up and demand a better life for yourself. Today, I'm going to be talking about two poems that I think represent this idea very, very well. Caged Bird by Maya Angelou and We Are Going by Oodgeroo Noonuccal. Despite having different contexts in which they were written, I think that both of these poems represent the idea that despite oppression and adversity, the voice of an oppressed people will always remain resilient and strong. Both of my poems are free verse, and both were written by civil rights activists. Caged Bird was written by Maya Angelou in 1983, and it uses birds as an allegory for the oppression of Black Americans in the United States. Oodgeroo Noonuccal was an Aboriginal Australian woman who wrote We Are Going in 1964. And it's about the post-colonial oppression of Aboriginal people and also the continued resilience of the Aboriginal culture. Both of these poems paint a picture of the adversity and hardship that people face when their culture is being oppressed. In Caged Bird, the poet does this through a juxtaposition between the free bird and the caged bird. The free bird leaps and floats around the dawn-bright lawn and the orange sun rays, and this visual and kinesthetic imagery represents the blissful freedom that people experience when they're not being oppressed. This sets up a really powerful juxtaposition because when the poem starts talking about the caged bird, it's got words like grave, shadow, nightmare, scream, and it creates a much more darker mood and a more despairing mood to represent the horror and the hardship of oppression. As well as the fact, obviously, the caged bird is trapped in a cage, it can't move, so this juxtaposes the kinesthetic imagery of the free bird, and it really represents the hardship of oppression. We Are Going also creates a representation of oppression, but in this poem it's less generalised and it's more specific to the Aboriginal Australian context. Near the start of the poem, the speaker says, "We are the corroboree and the bora ground." And this is a metaphor which alludes to important aspects of Aboriginal Australian culture, the corroboree and the bora ground. This sets the scene for the end of the poem. Here, the line length shortens, which connotes loss and diminishing culture, and the speaker says, "The bora ring is gone. The corroboree is gone." These lines are an epistrophe that parallels the allusions to corroboree and bora ground from the start of the poem, which clearly and kind of unmistakably represents the oppression and the loss of Aboriginal people and of their culture. Both of these poems have their own ways of representing oppression. But what's also important in these poems is how they represent the strong voice of the oppressed groups of people. In Caged Bird, even though he's trapped in a cage and he can't move, the bird still manages to sing. And the singing is a metaphor for self-expression and for freedom and protest against the oppression he faces. Also, the poem actually uses a lot of sound devices like assonance, iambic meter, rhyme, and enjambment, and these elements enhance the musicality of the poem. So it kind of sounds like the whole poem is a song. And as we've seen, in this poem, singing represents self-expression and protest. So it's almost as if this poem, Caged Bird, kind of is the voice of an oppressed speaker. A similar thing happens in We Are Going, where the poem starts to seem like the voice of an oppressed speaker. The start of the poem is told from a third-person point of view, where it describes the loss of the Aboriginal people and the oppression of their culture. But when the poem starts to explore the different aspects of Aboriginal culture, it switches to a first-person point of view, which we can see from this we pronoun. There's also quotation marks around this part of the poem, and the combination of these two factors tells us that this poem is being spoken from the voice of someone who's being oppressed. Both of these poems do a really good job at representing the voice of an oppressed people. However, the most important element of both the poems is the idea that despite the adversity they face, an oppressed people's voice will always stay resilient and it will always stay strong. In Caged Bird, there's a two-line refrain that gets repeated twice throughout the poem. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. Stanza 3, which is all about how the caged bird sings, also gets repeated word for word as the poem's final stanza. The repetition of these lines that convey the protesting voice and self-expression of the oppressed bird is what reinforces the strength of this voice, and it creates a sense of not giving up because it just keeps getting repeated throughout the poem. Okay, so Caged Bird uses repetition to represent how the voice of the oppressed people is resilient. We Are Going also uses repetition, but this poem, uses anaphora, which is a type of repetition. In the section of the poem that represents the oppressed speaker's voice, you've got all these lines that start with "we are." We are the corroboree. We are the old ceremonies. We are the wonder tales of Dreamtime. This forceful anaphora really kind of asserts the speaker's identity and connection to their culture, and this kind of repetitive we are, it creates a sense that this voice is going to be resilient, this culture is going to be resilient, and it's not going to be taken away easily. The difference in how these two poems represent the voice of the oppressed is mostly because of their different contextual backgrounds. Caged Bird was written in the United States in 1983, and it's a much more metaphorical and allegorical poem because it uses birds to represent the complex ideas of freedom and oppression. On the other hand, We Are Going was written in 1964 Australia, at a time when Aboriginal Australians had few rights and, they weren't even recognised as part of the population. We Are Going is much more of a protest poem, and it's because of this that it uses things like direct allusions and anaphora and parallelism to present a very clear message of resilience. In today's society, the treatment of marginalised groups like Black Americans and Aboriginal Australians has improved a lot since these poems were written, but the underlying discrimination hasn't completely gone away. These poems both represent oppression, with the overarching idea that the voice of an oppressed people will never be silenced and is always going to stay strong. Although oppression is a really terrible thing, these poems teach us that these marginalised communities, no matter what adversity they face, they'll always stay strong and resilient and insistent of their right to survive. The poems teach us that humanity will always fight to be heard, no matter what adversity or oppression it faces. Thanks for watching. Yeah.